Perfect. So, as mentioned, my name is Carolyn Smith. I'm honored to be a part of this seminar and present alongside everybody here today. I want to firstly recognize that I'm speaking with you today from the traditional territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. And I would also like to recognize and ground my research that I'm sharing with you today was done in the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So today, this is going to be a little bit about my master's thesis research, which was titled "What Response: An Extensive Review of Truth and Reconciliation in Canadian Archives." This was an assessment of the archival community within Canada to determine to what extent we have actually responded to the calls to action that were released by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also known as the TRC. So to give you a little bit of background before I jump into my research, the Canadian archival system has a long history in the settler nation state of Canada and can be understood through the history of the colonial project. Early public archives were designed as a support mechanism and a voice of amplification for the newly forming national identity of Canada, with the original state archive, now known as Library Archives Canada, being developed in the late 19th and early 20th century to document and support the creation of a new nation. And it also acted as an agent in the erasure of Indigenous presence within both culture and history through the support of a settler colonial narrative. So core to my research is the release of the calls to action in 2015 by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. They released 94 calls to action, each addressing the ongoing colonial legacy of the Indian residential school system and calling upon Canadians to assist in the advancement of reconciliation work. This is a multi-dimensional document with the 94 calls reaching various aspects of Canadian society. This included education, health and welfare, and the Canadian legal system, but this also addressed Canadian archives and other memory institutions. So having completed my research in 2025, a decade following the release of the calls to action, my research exists within a space between past responses to the TRC and the remaining work to be done in the archival community. This was done through an extensive review of every Indigenous and non-Indigenous archival organization within Canada whose information was made available publicly. From here, there were collected reports, policies, standards, guidelines, and academic writing, with data that demonstrated common themes, concepts, and practices related to deconstructing colonial systems within archives, and also an overall demonstration of our limited response to the TRC. I want to note that this research went beyond just creating a comprehensive report, but it also acted as a space to inform myself as a non-Indigenous archivist and support a way from transitioning to where we are within this oppressive system to where we need to be. So to support that work, I felt it was important to ground my research in Indigenous methodologies as well as the land that I was residing on at the time. So this included the theoretical framework from Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall's concept of two-eyed seeing and Cree and Coast Salish understandings of relationality. Two-eyed seeing teaches us to bring together the strengths of Indigenous and Western knowledge systems, while relationality reminds us that all beings are related and encourages all people to show respect for one another and for all other relations. The study took a two-staged approach, so just a little bit about the method here. I took a two-staged approach. Firstly, I conducted a search within academic databases to find all relevant peer-reviewed literature. And then secondly, I searched for all relevant gray literature that was made publicly available by federal, provincial, territorial, and community archival spaces. When you think about the vastness of Canada as a nation state, the fact that only 32 sources from academic literature and 55 sources from grey literature were found within the results definitely shows that there has been a limited response to the TRC spanning over a decade. So looking at the total number of sources from both the academic and grey literature results, there were 7 identifiable themes across all publications. This included discussions of access and control, Indigenous data sovereignty, ownership of archival materials, collaboration, community archiving, participatory archiving, and reconciliation. All of these themes collectively pointed towards a refusal of extraction and a movement toward an accountable and community-centered archival practice. Yet, despite the somewhat limited progress these documents represent, my research demonstrated a fundamental flaws within the Canadian archival system and identified that overall lack of response to implementation and change since 2015. So this included it identified more than 2 problems, but the 2 key problems that I wanted to share with you today is first, there was a huge disconnect between federal, provincial, and territorial institutions and community archives. And what I mean by that is the guidance, resources, tools, anything that was provided by that upper level of government was not easily implemented at the community level due to a lack of resources, staffing, and the various difficulties that communities face when it comes to archiving. And secondly, and probably most importantly, is the actual systemic colonial nature of the archival structures themselves. Without making a foundational change within the structure, reconciliation practices will constantly have friction and resistance. So from all of the data that was collected during this research, there were 4 indicators of success that showed whether or not an institution was meaningfully responding to the calls to action. And these indicators of success can also be used to guide both archives and archivists to further Indigenous sovereignty in memory holding spaces. So the 4 indicators included Indigenous ownership over archival materials, increased accessibility to archival materials, an implementation of collaborative participatory practices, and mandated policies supporting Indigenous self-determination. And although I could go into detail about each one of these indicators, for today I want to notice or make note of, at the core of this visual, the mandated policies supporting Indigenous self-determination. This was an indicator that was discussed in almost every document that I came across, every source that I came across, and there are 5 reasons that are drawn from that. So one is that policies act as guidelines for employees and users to respectfully engage with Indigenous archival materials and their communities. Policies require institutions to uphold the highest standards, and this can reflect Indigenous self-determination. They shift organizations away from Western ideas of ownership and access and have the ability to support a localized law and or cultural protocols. They are a public statement recognizing the need for change and ensuring the organization is working towards deconstructing colonial practices. And they are open to the public, which means that they require continual reflection, ensuring that the document meets the community needs. Having these as mandated documents enforces the organization to follow through with support of Indigenous self-determination, as well as it requires the organization to ensure that it is meeting community needs, that it is respecting what the community needs based on the information and archival material that it is holding. So I want to close off by talking about the core component of my research. This was identified throughout the entirety of my project, all the way from the beginning to designing the method, to navigating the results and realizing that so much work is yet to be done, and that within a decade, very little has come across, to navigating how we can approach things next. And that is shifting away from being passive to active responders to reconciliation movements. And what I mean by that is it's not enough to simply analyze or critique our colonial systems of memory. We must organize, imagine, and enact alternatives that dismantle them. Archives have the potential to take on an integral role in reconciliation, and they have the potential to demand accountability from Canada as a nation state. And although this study was never aimed to provide any new approaches, models, or best practices within the archival field, it calls for a fundamental shift in the mindset of the Canadian archival community to recognize that our accountability should not waver. That after a decade of creating resources, it is now time to become active participants and make institutional changes. We cannot stop at identifying the colonial harms embedded in archives. We must actively design, advocate for, and implement practices that dismantle those harms and support Indigenous sovereignty. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to later discussion and questions.